Kola's patience had been worn thin like an old piece of cloth on the verge of tearing. The whispers and side glances from the villagers were suffocating, like a noose tightening around his neck. He could feel their accusations, sharp as daggers, aimed at him and his family, cutting deep into his already wounded heart. Why must my family bear the brunt of this misfortune? He wondered, his thoughts swirling like a storm. The true culprits, the ones who deserved to be hunted down, roamed free, untouched by the justice they so richly deserved. Kola's mind was a cauldron of confusion and despair. The villagers of Mona, whom he had once tried to save, now turned against him. They were blind to his efforts, their eyes clouded with fear and suspicion, their fingers pointing at him as if he were the embodiment of all their woes. Why won't they let me explain? He thought bitterly, his grief still raw from the loss of his precious daughter, whose life had been swallowed by the village's chaos. What more could he do? The only options left were as bleak as a moonless night. Was there no path to peace other than the one paved with his family's blood? The gods, once his guiding light, now seemed indifferent, their hearts as cold as the stone idols in the village shrine. Desperation gnawed at his soul, and he realized there was only one course left to him: escape. Under the cover of darkness, with the night as his only ally, Kola gathered his wife and 2 daughters. Like a hunted animal fleeing from its predators, they slipped out of Mona, their footsteps silent but their hearts pounding with fear and uncertainty. For 4 days they journeyed, their bodies weary but driven by the hope of finding refuge. The path was long and treacherous, each step taking them farther from the life they once knew. When they finally arrived at Dosha village, Kola's wife was greeted by the familiar sights of her childhood, but for the children, it was a land of shadows and strange faces, as foreign as a distant star. Yet, even in this new village, something in Kola had changed. The man who had once sought only peace was now consumed by thoughts of vengeance, his soul darkened by the memory of the injustices he had endured at the hands of the king of Mona. Kola's mind churned with thoughts of betrayal, the bitter taste of how the king of Mona had treated him lingering like poison. He had never imagined that their bond, once as strong as the roots of an ancient tree, could wither and die. The sense of loss gnawed at him, deep and unrelenting. The days of trust and camaraderie felt like a distant memory, as if they belonged to another lifetime. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long shadows across their new home, Kola's eldest daughter, Maria, broke the silence that hung heavy in the room. Her voice, laced with curiosity and an innocence that pained Kola, cut through his brooding thoughts. "Papa, why did we have to leave our village?" she asked, her eyes searching his for answers she had long been denied. Kola knew the time had come. The secret he had buried deep within him, the secret that had driven them from their home, could no longer be kept hidden. With a deep sigh, he began to unravel the tale, his voice carrying the weight of the memories he wished he could forget. "Maria," he began, his tone grave and measured, "a long time ago, in a place called Town, there lived 2 orphaned twins. These sisters were the talk of the town, not just for their beauty, which was unmatched, but for the way they carried themselves, endowed with curves that made men lose their senses. Their presence was a force, magnetic and dangerous, and most men in the village couldn't resist the urge to be near them, to push themselves into their lives in any way possible." Kola's words drew his children closer, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and fascination. But these sisters were not just pretty faces. They were the heart of mischief in the village, their names whispered in the dark corners where secrets were shared. Despite this, they were also the best food sellers in Manor Village, their dishes so delicious that people came from all around just to taste their cooking. But what the villagers didn't know was that the sisters had a dark secret. Every morning, as they prepared their meals, They would wash their bodies, especially their private parts, into the food they sold to the people. This vile act seemed to hold some strange power over the villagers, drawing them to the canteen day after day, as if bewitched. Kola paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. One day, a man approached the sisters with an offer. He was a man with dark intentions, and he saw an opportunity in the power these sisters wielded. He offered them a deal, one that promised wealth and influence in exchange for something unthinkable. He demanded the manhood of the village men. To the sisters, this was an easy task. They had what it took to attract any man to their canteen, and they knew how to manipulate the desires of those who came to eat. It was a game to them, a game that would have devastating consequences. One sunny afternoon, as Kola made his way back from the market, his thoughts were heavy with longing and frustration. The absence of a male child in his household was a burden that weighed on him daily. He had decided that the next day, he would visit the local doctor to seek answers. Lost in these thoughts, he found himself wandering into the food canteen run by the infamous twins. The aroma of their cooking wafted through the air, enticing him further inside. Kenny, one of the sisters, greeted him with a smile that seemed warm yet laced with something unspoken. Kola ordered his meal, and as he sat down to eat, Kenny moved closer, her presence almost intoxicating. She began to entertain him, her laughter like a melody that dulled his senses. Kola, usually a man of discipline, felt his guard slipping. His thoughts, once occupied with his family and their future, now fixated on the alluring figure beside him. When Kenny's hand brushed against his, something primal awoke in him. Without thinking, he reached out and grabbed her, his desires overtaking his reason. Kenny responded with a knowing smile, and in that moment, all thoughts of his worries disappeared. She leaned in, her touch sending shivers down his spine as her hand found its way to his manhood. A strange sensation washed over Kola, as though something vital had been drained from him, but in his dazed state, he didn't care. The two of them slipped away to the back of the kitchen, where they indulged in a fleeting moment of forbidden pleasure. Kola returned home that evening, feeling oddly fulfilled, as if he had found an escape from the stresses that plagued him. He resolved to visit the canteen more often, believing it to be a place of solace and satisfaction. But his wife, unaware of his secret, continued to press him about seeing the native doctor about the fact that they had no male child. Days passed, and the weight of her words finally pushed Kola to visit the doctor. The consultation, however, brought news that Kola was unprepared for. The native doctor, after a thorough examination, looked at Kola with grave eyes. "Your manhood has been taken," he said quietly. The words struck Kola like a blow, leaving him reeling in disbelief. "This is not a new problem," the doctor continued. "Many men in this village have faced the same fate. But who could have used them? And for what purpose?" Kola's mind raced, panic setting in as he pondered how he could possibly explain this to his wife. In his confusion, he found himself drawn back to the canteen, the place where he had felt a twisted sense of comfort. Every evening, he returned, not just for the food, but for the company of the twins. He listened to the other men who frequented the canteen, many of whom began to whisper about their own diminishing strength, their inability to perform as they once had. Something was clearly amiss, and Kola knew he had to uncover the truth. One night, he decided to confront Kenny. He waited until most of the other patrons had left, then called her aside and shared his concerns. Kenny's eyes flickered with something Kola couldn't quite place: fear, perhaps, or maybe guilt. She and her sister exchanged worried glances, and from that moment, they began to tread carefully, aware that their secrets were on the verge of being exposed. But Kola's suspicions only grew. Late one evening, as he was on his way home, he suddenly remembered that he had left his sack at the canteen. He returned, but found the doors locked. Determined, he made his way to the backyard, where he was met with an unexpected sight. One of the twins was hurriedly carrying a small pot, her movements quick and furtive. Intrigued, Kola followed her, keeping to the shadows. The twin made her way into the bush, where a man was waiting for her. Kola watched as she handed the pot to the man, who then gave her a bag of money in exchange. For 2 days, Kola continued to observe the sisters, piecing together the dark puzzle of their actions. Then, on the 3rd night, he saw something that made his blood run cold. He had returned to the canteen late, after Kenny had finished her nightly delivery. She entered the kitchen, unaware that Kola was watching. He saw her, with his own eyes, washing her private parts into the pot of food that was to be sold the next day. Kola's anger erupted like a volcano. He burst into the kitchen, a knife in his hand, his face contorted with rage. Kenny froze, her eyes wide with fear as she saw the blade glinting in the dim light. "What's in the pot?" Kola demanded, his voice a growl of fury. "And why do you defile the food with your body?" Kenny stammered, backing away from him, her fear palpable. But Kola wasn't in the mood for excuses. The truth was out now, and he would stop at nothing to get to the bottom of it. As Kenny struggled to free herself from Kola's grip, panic overtook her movements. In her desperate attempt to escape, she twisted violently, and her head collided with the wall with a sickening thud. The life drained from her body instantly, and she crumpled to the floor, lifeless. Kola stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat, unable to process what had just happened. She was dead before she could reveal the answers he so desperately sought. Fear surged through him as he realized the gravity of what he had done. He had to flee, and quickly, before her sister Taiwo returned. With his heart pounding like a drum in his chest, Kola stumbled out of the room, his mind racing. The horror of the situation weighed heavily on him, but he forced himself to think clearly. He slipped into the shadows, disappearing just as Taiwo returned. The moment she entered the room, her eyes fell on her sister's lifeless body sprawled on the floor. A piercing scream escaped her lips, echoing through the village as she cried out for help. The villagers gathered, their faces pale with shock as they looked upon the scene. The death of Kenny cast a dark pall over the village, and her loss was mourned in a heavy, ominous silence. Days passed, but no one could determine who had killed her, or why. Taiwo, consumed by grief and confusion, was determined to find answers. But as she set off to uncover the truth, she had no idea that Kola was following her, his curiosity and fear intertwining in a dangerous dance. Kola's worry grew with every step as he trailed Taiwo through the dense forest. The shadows of the trees seemed to close in on him, and the further they went, the more his anxiety deepened. What was in the pot that Kenny had been delivering? Who was the mysterious man she met, and why did he want the manhood of the village men? Taiwo was the only one who could provide the answers, and Kola knew he had to stay close. As Taiwo quickened her pace, her steps driven by a simmering anger, Kola struggled to keep up. He ducked behind trees and bushes, making sure to remain unseen. Finally, Taiwo arrived at a secluded clearing, a place Kola recognized with a shudder. It was the same spot where he had seen Kenny meet the veiled man to exchange the pot. Hidden among the trees, Kola watched with bated breath as Taiwo approached the figure already waiting there. "You killed her." Taiwo's voice was filled with venom as she confronted the man. Her grief had turned to fury, and it poured out in her words. "You killed my sister, and I will make sure everyone knows what you've been doing. You're going to pay for this." The man took a step closer to her, his face still obscured by the veil. His voice was cold and menacing as he replied, "You should be careful with your words. You don't know who you're dealing with." But Taiwo's anger only grew. "I'll expose you," she spat. "I'll tell everyone that you've been buying the villagers' manhoods and destroying our men." In a flash, the man's hand shot out, seizing Taiwo by the throat. Kola watched in helpless terror as the man's grip tightened, squeezing the life out of her. Taiwo struggled, her hands clawing at his arm, but it was no use. Within moments, her body went limp, and she collapsed, lifeless, at the man's feet. Kola had screamed in horror and rushed forward, but it was already too late. Taiwo was dead, her body a tragic echo of her sister's fate. The man turned to flee, but Kola, driven by a desperate need for answers, was faster. He lunged forward and grabbed the man's veil, pulling it free. The sight that met his eyes sent a chill through his bones. It was the king. The very man who was supposed to protect and serve the village, the man who held the trust of every villager, was the one behind the monstrous acts all along. He had been buying the manhoods, using the twins as pawns in his dark and twisted game. Kola's world spun as he stared into the face of the man he had once respected, now revealed as the architect of their suffering. The king, realizing that his dark secrets had been uncovered, fixed Kola with a cold, penetrating gaze. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into," he hissed, his voice dripping with malice. "If you utter a single word about this, I will kill you. Not just you, but your entire family will suffer, and you will die a shameful and excruciating death." Kola stared at the king, his mind reeling. Fear clutched at his heart, and he felt as though the walls of the forest were closing in around him. He had never intended to unravel such a dangerous truth. His only goal had been to discover who was behind the sinister theft of the village men's manhoods. But now, he was standing face to face with the man who held all the power, and the weight of that knowledge threatened to crush him. The king had always been a figure of authority, someone who commanded respect and obedience. Kola knew that if he tried to expose him, the consequences would be dire. The king could easily silence him, and the thought of his family being dragged into this nightmare made his blood run cold. But how could he live with himself if he stayed silent? The village men had already reported the mysterious loss of their manhoods to the king, who had promised to find the root of the problem. But Kola now knew that the king was the very source of their suffering. The king must have seen the conflict in Kola's eyes, the flicker of hesitation that betrayed his inner turmoil. With a cruel smile, he leaned in closer. "Think carefully, Kola," he whispered. "Everything depends on your silence." With that, the king turned and melted into the shadows, leaving Kola alone in the dark, his mind a whirlwind of fear and indecision. As he made his way home, Kola wrestled with the impossible choice before him. He could flee, take his family far away from the village, and try to escape the king's wrath. But how could he abandon the people of Mona, knowing what he knew? The village men were suffering, unable to father children, and the king, their supposed protector, was the root of their torment. Kola knew he had to make a decision, and soon. As he continued his story to his children, Kola's voice grew heavy with the weight of the memories. The following day, he said, "I was still deep in thought, trying to decide what to do, when Maria came to find me. She told me the king had arrived at our house." Maria, now sitting beside her father, nodded in affirmation. "I remember that day, Papa," she said, her voice soft. "It's still so clear in my mind, just like it happened yesterday." Kola continued, his eyes distant as he recalled the events. "I was surprised, even anxious, to know what had brought the king to my house. When we spoke, he told me, and everyone around, that he was surveying the village, trying to get to the bottom of the news about the stolen manhoods. He made it sound like he was on our side, that he was working to protect us. The memory of the king's deception still burned in Kola's mind. But then, the king said something that caught me off guard. He continued. He told me that while he was surveying the village, he met a beautiful young woman who claimed to be my daughter. He then announced that he wanted to give my daughter to his son in marriage, making our family's in-laws. The news had sent a wave of excitement through everyone present, everyone except Kola. While the villagers saw it as a great honor, a sign that the king truly cared for the people, Kola knew better. He could see through the king's ruse, the cunning way he was trying to trap him. The king was attempting to bind Kola to him, to ensure his silence by bringing their families together. Before the king left, he instructed Kola to give him a positive response by that evening, leaving no room for refusal. The pressure weighed heavily on Kola as he realized that the king was tightening his grip on him, trying to secure his compliance through fear and manipulation. Kola knew deep down that the king's offer was a cunning trap designed to silence him and keep him under control. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that returning to the king's palace to give his feedback was a grave mistake. He should have fled the village with his family, escaping the clutches of the king's treachery. If he had done that, his beloved daughter Dara might still be alive. But instead, driven by a sense of duty and fear, Kola made his way to the king's palace that fateful evening. As the two men sat alone in the dimly lit chamber, Kola gathered the courage to tell the king that his daughter was not yet ready for marriage. But the king, sensing that Kola would be a thorn in his side, decided to take matters into his own hands. He knew the only way to tame Kola and ensure his silence was to take control of his family. With a sinister glint in his eye, the king ordered that Kola be thrown into a cell. He then summoned his guards and instructed them to bring Kola's family to the palace under the cover of night, so that no one would know they had been taken. The guards, loyal to the king's every command, wasted no time in carrying out his orders. Under the cloak of darkness, they descended upon Kola's home and forcibly brought his wife and children to the palace. They were placed in a cell directly opposite Kola's, where he could see them but was powerless to help. The king, with cruel satisfaction, had Kola tortured in front of his family for 4 agonizing days. The sight of his wife and children watching him suffer was almost more than Kola could bear, but the king was relentless. When the king finally grew tired of the torture, he approached Kola with a chilling ultimatum. "I will kill all of your daughters before your very eyes," the king declared, his voice cold and devoid of mercy, "and then I will keep you alive to be tortured forever." The king's words sent a shiver down Kola's spine. He reminded Kola that he could easily dispose of him and his family without consequence, as the guards who had taken them were disguised as ordinary villagers, ensuring that no one would ever suspect the king's involvement. The king gave Kola a day to reconsider his decision, leaving him to ponder the grim future that awaited him and his family. As soon as the king left, Kola's wife, filled with dread and confusion, began questioning her husband. "What is going on between you and the king?" she asked, her voice trembling. But Kola, broken and defeated, could only hang his head in silence, unable to find the words to explain the nightmare they were living. The next day, Kola was brought before the king once more. This time, he had no choice but to submit to the king's demands. He agreed to allow his first daughter, Dara, to marry the prince. But even as he agreed, a troubling thought nagged at him: was there truly a prince? No one in the village had ever seen the prince before. The doubt gnawed at Kola, but he was in no position to question the king further. A wedding date was set, and the entire village erupted in excitement. The people saw the union as a great honor, a bond between their village and the royal family. But beneath the surface of this joyous occasion, darker secrets were waiting to be uncovered. After the marriage, as Dara settled into her new life at the palace, she began to notice strange things. The prince, her husband, was not like other men. He had no manhood, and his form was not fully human. Curiosity, and perhaps a growing sense of fear, drove Dara to confront the prince. She needed to know the truth, and though the prince was hesitant at first, his love for her eventually won out. He confessed the dark secret he had been hiding. The prince began his story with a heavy heart. "Long ago, I was an irresponsible son," he admitted. "I would sneak out of the palace without my father's consent, ignoring his warnings and restrictions. Despite my father's efforts to keep me in line, I always found a way to slip away. During one of these escapades, I met a beautiful woman named Toba. We fell deeply in love, and I would go to great lengths to see her, even if it meant disobeying my father." The prince paused, as if gathering the strength to continue. One night, a ritual was to be performed in the village, a ritual that required no male to be seen outside after dark. It was a time when the spirits were to be appeased, spirits that loathed the sight of men. Toba, knowing this, convinced me to meet her one last time before she left Mona village. Blinded by love, I agreed, despite the dangers. Toba gave me a powder charm, the prince continued, his voice heavy with regret. I used it to put the guards to sleep, and I slipped out of the palace unnoticed. But as I waited for Toba, something terrible happened. I encountered a spirit, a faceless entity that struck me down with a force I could not resist. The next thing I knew, my body had been changed, and my manhood was gone. The prince's confession left Dara reeling. The man she had married, the Prince of Mona, was cursed, a curse brought upon him by his own reckless actions. And now, she was entangled in the web of secrets and lies that surrounded the royal family. The prince waited for hours in the darkness, his heart pounding with a mix of anxiety and anticipation, but Toba never came. The night dragged on, and eventually, he gave up hope and began the long walk back to the palace. Meanwhile, the king, unaware of his son's disobedience, was deep in conversation with his most trusted advisor, Chief Kudi. The two of them attended the ritual together, their minds focused on the ceremony and the matters of state. The king, carried away by the gravity of the ritual and the company of Chief Kudi, didn't notice that his son was missing. As the prince trudged home, alone and frustrated, he suddenly felt a cold, heavy presence beside him. Before he could react, a faceless spirit struck him with a force that knocked the breath from his lungs. The impact was so strong that it sent him reeling, and when he turned to confront the spirit, it was too late. The faceless entity had already begun its dark work. Within seconds, the prince's body twisted and contorted into a monstrous form, and his manhood vanished as if it had never existed. The following morning, as the sun rose over Mona village, the guards awoke to find the prince missing. Panic spread through the palace like wildfire. The king, who had been so sure of his son's safety, was now faced with a nightmare he had never anticipated. He sent out search parties to scour the village and the surrounding forests, desperate to find the prince. The palace was in turmoil, and the king was consumed with guilt, blaming himself for being too distracted by the ritual to notice his son's absence. Chief Kudi, ever the loyalist, did his best to calm the king's fears. He assured the king that all would be well, even as the uncertainty gnawed at him. When the search parties finally found the prince, he was lying unconscious, his body changed beyond recognition. The king's heart sank when he saw what had become of his son, a monstrous figure where his heir should have been, and his manhood gone. The king, though devastated, instantly understood the gravity of what had happened. Chief Coody, seeing the king's despair, suggested they seek the help of a powerful herbalist. The king agreed, and a renowned herbalist was brought from a distant village. After examining the prince, the herbalist delivered his grim verdict. To restore the prince to his human form, they would need to collect a manhood from another man. The herbalist explained that the prince would return to human form once a month, and during that time, a ritual had to be performed using the collected manhood. This process would have to be repeated weekly until the prince fully regained his manhood. The herbalist also made it clear that the collection and handling of the manhood must be overseen by the king himself. The king, desperate to save his son, turned to Chief Coody for assistance. Chief Coody assured him that he knew just the right people for the job. He contacted the two beautiful twin sisters, who had already proven themselves capable of enticing the men of the village. With a hefty payment from the king's coffers, the twins were enlisted to carry out the dark task. The prince finished his story, his voice filled with regret and sorrow. Without another word, Dara excused herself and hurried home to tell her father, Kola, everything she had learned. When she arrived, she found Kola waiting anxiously. As Dara recounted the prince's tale, Kola's mind raced. He finally understood why the manhood of the village men had been stolen and how the king, the one they had all trusted, was behind it. The realization hit him like a thunderbolt. The king, who had promised to protect his people, was instead the architect of their suffering. Kola warned Dara to tread carefully, knowing that her time in the palace was coming to an end. The king and Chief Coody will be punished, he assured her, though the words did little to ease his fears. His thoughts turned back to Kenny, the twin he had seen washing herself in the food meant for the villagers. There had to be more to their actions, something even darker that he had yet to uncover. What Kola didn't know was that Chief Coody had been listening when the prince revealed his secret to Dara. The chief, realizing that Dara now posed a threat to their plans, quietly followed her as she left the palace. As Dara made her way back to the palace, unaware of the danger lurking behind her, Chief Coody struck. He killed Dara swiftly, leaving her lifeless body on the road, a silent victim of his ruthless ambition. When news of Dara's death reached Kola, his grief quickly turned to rage. He stormed the palace, his heart burning with a desire for vengeance. Believing the king had ordered his daughter's murder, Kola confronted him, threatening to expose all of the king's evil deeds to the villagers. The king, fearing exposure and desperate to protect his dark secrets, ordered Kola and his entire family to be killed. Though he didn't know that Chief Coody had acted on his own in killing Dara, the king saw no other way to protect himself. As the king's guards moved to carry out the order, Kola's fate and the fate of his family hung in the balance, the consequences of the king's cruelty and deception reaching their inevitable, tragic conclusion. However, the king's initial bravado faltered as the fear of the villagers began to weigh on him. The people of Mona, already restless and suspicious, would not take kindly to the sudden disappearance of an entire family, especially one as prominent as Kola's. Reluctantly, the king withdrew his order and summoned Kola to the palace. He needed to find a way to control the situation without causing an uproar. When Kola arrived, the king attempted to speak calmly, but his voice betrayed the underlying tension. He urged Kola to listen, to consider the consequences of his actions. But Kola, his fury barely contained, wasn't in the mood for negotiations. He cut the king off, his voice rising with each word. "I know what you and Chief Coody have been doing," Kola shouted, his eyes blazing with righteous anger. "You've been sending the twin sisters to steal the manhoods of the men in the village, and worse, you've had them wash their private parts in the food sold to the people. How could you do this to your own people? The king was taken aback by Kola's accusation, a shockwave of realization hitting him. Could it be that the washing of the sisters' private parts in the food was the reason the charm wasn't working? His mind raced. The customers who consumed the food were unknowingly ingesting the remnants of the charm, perhaps rendering it useless. His son should have been healed by now, but instead, the curse persisted. The king's thoughts turned to Chief Kudi. Could Kudi have had ulterior motives all along? Was this all part of a larger scheme to undermine the king's power? No, the king muttered to himself, trying to shake off the suspicion. But the seeds of doubt had been planted, and they took root deep in his mind. The truth of the situation gnawed at him, but before he could delve further into his thoughts, Kola's angry shouts pulled him back to the present. In a moment of desperation, the king seized Kola by the arm, his grip firm and his voice cold. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into, Kola. Be very careful with your next move." Despite the warning, Kola wasn't intimidated. He stormed out of the palace, determined to expose the king's misdeeds. As soon as he returned home, he began spreading the news of the king's treachery to anyone who would listen. The whispers spread like wildfire, and the once quiet village buzzed with rumors and accusations. Panicked, the king turned to Chief Kudi for advice. Kudi, ever the manipulator, suggested a plan to divert the villagers' anger. They would spread a counter-rumor, one that painted Kola as the true villain. The king agreed, and soon the story began circulating that it was Kola who had caused the death of the twin sisters, blaming him for the turmoil that had befallen the village. Kola was incredulous when he heard the lies being told about him. How could the king, the very man responsible for all this evil, turn the villagers against him? But the damage had been done. The villagers, already confused and scared, quickly turned on Kola, demanding that he and his family be brought to justice. Realizing that his life and the lives of his family were in imminent danger, Kola made a heart-wrenching decision. He gathered his family and fled Mona village, leaving behind everything they had ever known. As they traveled through the night, Kola's heart was heavy with grief and frustration. He had tried to save the village, to find a cure for the stolen manhoods, but instead, he was forced to flee like a criminal. "Why won't they stop blaming my family?" Kola muttered bitterly as they made their way through the darkness. "It wasn't our fault. The real culprits are still free, and now we are the ones being hunted." The pain of losing his daughter Dara weighed on him, adding to the crushing sense of injustice. "I've already lost my precious Dara," he thought. "What more do they want from me? Isn't there another way to settle this than demanding our blood?" As they walked, Maria, his daughter, interrupted his thoughts. "Papa, if the twin sisters were really selling the manhoods of the men in the village, why were they washing their private parts in the food?" Kola was silent for a moment, the question lingering in the air like a dark cloud. He didn't have an answer that would satisfy her, but he knew one thing for sure: their suffering wasn't over yet. Back in Mona, the king couldn't shake the doubt that had taken root in his mind. Kola's words echoed in his thoughts, making him question everything. Could Chief Kudi have an ulterior motive? He wondered, the paranoia creeping into his soul. The idea that Kudi might have been sabotaging the ritual all along gnawed at him. Driven by a need to regain control, the king made a decision. If Kudi had indeed betrayed him, then Kudi would have to pay the price. He would use Kudi's manhood as the next offering. The king clenched his fists, determined to feel the weight of Kudi's betrayal. But even as the king plotted his next move, the village of Mona teetered on the edge of chaos, the truth and lies so tightly intertwined that no one knew who to trust anymore. Days passed in a blur of uncertainty and fear for Kola and his family. The weight of their predicament hung over them like a dark cloud, and with each passing day, Kola began to lose hope. It seemed that the truth would remain buried, and the injustices they had suffered would never be righted. But then, one evening, just as the last light of day faded from the sky, there was a knock at the door. Kola opened it to find a mysterious figure standing on the threshold. It was Toba, the woman who had once lured the crown prince into his fateful encounter with the spirit. Her face was drawn, her eyes shadowed with the weight of untold secrets and years of regret. "I have come to right a wrong," Toba said, her voice trembling with sorrow. She entered the house, and as they sat down, she began to reveal the truth that had haunted her for so long. Toba told Kola everything, how Chief Kudi had manipulated her into luring the prince away from the safety of the palace, knowing full well the danger that awaited him. She explained how the spirit had cursed the prince, transforming him into a monster, and how she had secretly followed Kola's family because she had sensed that something was terribly wrong. She revealed that the prince had been meant to be fully healed of his curse before being married, but Chief Kudi had ensured that this would never happen. For months, Toba had been locked away by Chief Kudi, kept in silence to prevent her from revealing the truth. But she had managed to escape, fleeing the village to save herself. Now, she had returned, determined to expose the chief's treachery. The twins washing their private parts in the food, Toba continued, her voice barely above a whisper, was not just some meaningless ritual. Chief Kudi ordered them to do it because he knew it would neutralize the charms meant to heal the prince. He wanted the prince to remain cursed, to keep the king under his thumb, so that one day, he could seize the throne for himself. Kola listened to Toba's confession, anger and determination rising within him. With this information and Toba's presence as a witness, he knew they could finally expose Chief Kudi and the king to the villagers. But first, they had to confront the king. That night, under the cover of darkness, Kola and Toba made their way back to Mona. They slipped into the palace unnoticed, moving silently through the corridors until they reached the king's chambers. What they found there took them by surprise. The king was in the midst of a heated argument with Chief Kudi. "I know what you've been doing, Kudi," the king shouted, his voice shaking with fury. "You've been deceiving me, using my son's curse to control me, and you dared to order those sisters to wash their bodies in the food, ruining everything." Chief Kudi, realizing that his betrayal had been uncovered, sneered at the king. "You're a fool, my king," he spat. "You always were. You were so easy to manipulate, so desperate to save your son. But now, it's too late. You and your cursed bloodline will die, and I will take over the throne." In a flash, Chief Kudi raised his charm, preparing to strike the king down. But the king, driven by desperation, dodged the attack. The palace erupted into chaos as their incantations filled the air, the two men locked in a deadly struggle. But in their anger and haste, they underestimated the power of their own magic. The charms they hurled at each other backfired, their dark forces turning against them. Kola and Toba watched in horror as the king and Chief Kudi screamed in agony, their bodies writhing as the curses they had invoked consumed them. In moments, they fell to the ground, lifeless, their bodies twisted and unrecognizable. The very curses they had sought to wield had claimed them in the end. As the first light of dawn broke over the village, the villagers gathered outside the palace, drawn by the commotion. They found Kola and Toba standing over the bodies of the king and Chief Kudi, the truth now laid bare. Without wasting time, Kola revealed the full extent of the king's and Kudi's treachery, with Toba backing up every word. The villagers, upon hearing the confession, were filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. The king, the man they had trusted to protect them, had been responsible for their suffering all along. Their faith in the crown had been shattered, and the weight of the betrayal left them reeling. But as for the crown prince, despite Kola's efforts to uncover the truth, it was too late to save him. The curse had endured for too long, and the prince, having exceeded his years of possible healing, died that very day, his body reverting to its human form in death. Though Kola and his family were finally free from the blame that had haunted them, the victory was bittersweet. The truth had come out, but the cost had been high. They mourned the loss of Dara, Kola's daughter, whose life had been cut short by the very evil they had fought against. If only I hadn't let Dara go back to the palace, Kola thought, his heart heavy with regret. She would still be alive today. The dark days had passed, but the scars they left behind remained. With heavy hearts, Kola and his family chose to leave Mona behind for good. They settled in Dosha village, where they hoped to find peace and begin anew. But the memories of what they had endured would stay with them forever, a reminder of the darkness that had once overshadowed their lives. Kola and his family, though free from the immediate dangers that had once surrounded them, carried with them the heavy burden of their past. As they settled into their new life in Dosha village, the tale of their trials in Mona became a story passed down from generation to generation, a cautionary tale that served as both a warning and a lesson. The villagers of Dosha, and eventually those from neighboring villages, would often gather around the fire at night, listening intently as the elders recounted the story of Kola, the cursed prince, and the treacherous chief Kudi. The tale began with the dangerous allure of unchecked power, embodied in the figure of the king who, in his desperation to save his son, allowed himself to be manipulated by his most trusted advisor. It was a story that reminded everyone that even those in positions of great authority could fall prey to fear and greed, leading them down dark paths. The story also spoke of the twin sisters, whose beauty and cunning were used for evil purposes. It was a reminder that outward appearances could be deceiving, and that one should always be wary of those who wield their influence for selfish gains. The villagers learned from this that no one is above scrutiny and that even the most trusted members of a community must be held accountable for their actions. But perhaps the most enduring lesson was the one of courage and resilience. Kola's journey was a testament to the strength of the human spirit, even in the face of overwhelming odds. He stood against the forces of darkness, even when it meant risking everything he held dear. His determination to uncover the truth, to protect his family, and to seek justice for those who had been wronged became a beacon of hope and a source of inspiration for all who heard his tale. Yet, the story also carried a somber warning, one that lingered in the minds of those who listened. It was a reminder that evil, once unleashed, could spread like wildfire, consuming everything in its path if left unchecked. The villagers learned that complacency and silence in the face of wrongdoing could allow such evils to grow, until they became too powerful to control. The tale of Mona was a call to vigilance, urging everyone to stand against injustice, no matter the cost, and to protect their community from those who would seek to harm it for their own gain. In the end, Kola's story was not just a recounting of past events, but a living lesson, a cautionary tale that warned of the dangers of power, the importance of integrity, and the necessity of courage in the face of evil. It reminded the villagers of Dosha, and all who heard it, that the fight against darkness was a continuous one, and that each generation must take up the mantle to ensure that the light of truth and justice never fades. And so, as the years passed, Kola and his family found peace in Dosha, their story a part of the village's collective memory. But the lessons they left behind lived on, guiding the actions of those who came after, ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated, and that the village would remain a place of safety, truth, and honor for generations to come.